When my daughter-in-law first told me I didn't belong in my own home, I remember feeling a strange quiet inside me. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply smiled, though it was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile someone wears when their heart feels broken, yet they do not want anyone to see it. I had lived in this house for decades, raised my son here, watched him grow from a little boy into the man he is today. Every wall, every corner, every small piece of furniture held memories of laughter, lessons, and late-night stories. And yet, in a single sentence, it all felt like it was slipping away from me. I remembered the morning vividly. The sunlight fell softly through the kitchen window, casting golden light on the old wooden table where I had once served my family breakfast. My daughter-in-law, standing there with her arms crossed, looked at me with a calm, almost clinical expression. "This is not your home anymore," she said. Those words, so simple, so final, echoed through my mind. I wanted to respond, to argue, but something inside me told me that silence would carry more weight than any words I could speak. I walked slowly to the window, watching the birds in the garden outside. Their carefree songs contrasted sharply with the heaviness in my chest. I thought about my son, standing beside her quietly. He did not say a word. He never did. That silence, the silence of someone who should have spoken, felt heavier than any confrontation could have been. My mind drifted back to the day he left for college, the day he got married, and the countless little moments I had spent hoping he would remember where he came from. I wondered when the shift had started. When did the home we built together stop being mine? Was it the day she moved in? Or had it begun long before, in the small, unnoticed moments when decisions were made without asking me? The truth was hard to pin down. It was subtle, creeping in like the cold that slips through the cracks of a closed window, barely noticed until it has chilled the whole room. I thought about my own feelings. I was hurt, yes, but more than that, I was disappointed. Disappointed that my son, the boy who used to run to me when he scraped his knee, could stand silently while someone else declared that I was no longer welcome in the house I loved. I remembered every night I had stayed up to make sure he was warm, fed, and safe. Every holiday, every celebration, every small sacrifice I had made seemingly erased by a single sentence. Yet, amidst this storm of emotions, I realized something important. Anger would not help. Complaints would not help. Raising my voice would only echo in empty walls and offer her the satisfaction of seeing me disturbed. There was power in staying calm, in showing quiet strength. I had learned this from life itself. Patience is a strength that many do not see, but it carries its own dignity. I looked around the house. The chairs where we had shared countless meals, the pictures of my family hanging on the walls, even the clock ticking steadily above the fireplace, they all whispered stories of the past. And I realized that no one could take those memories from me. No one could erase the love I had poured into this home, the life I had lived here, and the mother I had been. I did not want anyone to see the tears forming in my eyes. So I took a deep breath and stepped away from the window. I moved to the kitchen table, where I carefully prepared a cup of tea for myself. The steam rose gently, curling in the air like tiny reminders that life continues, no matter how painful the present moment may feel. I took a sip and let the warmth fill me, letting it be a small comfort in the middle of a storm I could not control. I remembered my mother, my own guidance through hard times. She had taught me that silence is sometimes louder than words, that a calm heart can endure the loudest storms, that dignity is maintained not by confrontation but by holding your ground within yourself. I held on to that thought now, as the day stretched on and the quiet tension of the house became almost unbearable. And yet, even in my silent endurance, there was a flicker of hope. Perhaps my son did not see the full depth of what was happening. Perhaps he was caught between loyalty, fear, and indecision. Perhaps in time, he would realize the truth that home is not just a building, but the people who love and care for it. And in that hope, I found a strange sort of peace, small and fragile, but enough to carry me through the hours that followed. I spent the rest of the morning in quiet observation. Every sound, every movement in the house seemed amplified. I watched her as she moved from room to room, arranging things, marking her territory without a glance at me. I watched my son, silent, hesitant, sometimes looking at me with uncertainty in his eyes, but never speaking. And I realized that the story of this house, of this family, was still being written. And though today was painful, tomorrow might hold a different ending. I sat there for hours, reflecting on what had brought us here, on the choices, the small misunderstandings, and the quiet resentments that had built up over time. I thought about the importance of forgiveness, not just for others, but for myself. I thought about the resilience that life had taught me, the strength that comes from enduring silently, and the deep love that remains even when it feels unappreciated. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was not a smile of victory, nor was it a smile of relief. It was the smile of someone who knows that pain is temporary, that dignity cannot be taken by words alone, and that patience may yet bring understanding where anger would fail. I took one last look around the room, feeling a mixture of sorrow and quiet strength. This was my home. This was my life. And though others might try to rewrite its meaning, I still held the true story within my heart. After that morning, the house felt different. I moved through it quietly, taking note of every detail: the way the sunlight fell across the carpet, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Everything seemed the same, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. My home had changed, and with it, my place within it. It was strange, almost surreal, to see people I loved and cared for act as if I were no longer central to the life we had built together. I thought about my son, my boy who used to run into my arms after school, the one I had kissed on the forehead when he was sick, the one I had stayed awake for night after night during his teenage years. He was now a man, married, and yet I had believed he would never forget where he came from. But slowly, I began to see the subtle shifts, the quiet avoidance, the small excuses, the moments when he would hesitate before including me in conversations or decisions. At first, I brushed it off, thinking perhaps it was just the natural changes of life, the way children grow and make their own homes. But when she arrived, the changes became undeniable. My daughter-in-law carried herself with a confidence that filled the rooms, and everywhere she went, the house seemed to bend to her will. I watched as she rearranged furniture, organized things her way, made small comments about what belonged where and how things should be done. And my son, my own child, would only nod silently, sometimes looking at me with a mixture of guilt and uncertainty, never offering a word of reassurance. I remember the first night she spent here. She moved through the rooms with precision, as if marking her territory, and I felt an unfamiliar sensation, an ache deep in my chest. I thought about speaking, about telling her that this house was my home too, that I had spent decades creating the warmth and comfort that now surrounded her. But the words never came. I chose silence instead, sitting quietly in the living room, letting the sounds of her footsteps echo through the house while I held my heart steady. It was in those quiet moments that I began to reflect on my own journey. I thought about all the years I had dedicated to this family, the birthdays celebrated, the holidays arranged, the meals cooked, the illnesses nursed, the arguments calmed, the dreams supported. I remembered each child as they grew, every laugh and tear shared, every lesson taught. And I realized that even if the present felt painful, those memories could never be taken from me. They were mine, etched into my heart, unshakable and permanent. I spent days observing the subtle dynamics that had begun to shift. Small gestures, small words, small decisions all seemed to signal that my presence was no longer welcome in the way it once had been. My son would often consult her before including me, waiting for her approval before offering a smile or a word of conversation. I saw how she guided him, steered him, shaped the household to her preferences. And though I felt hurt, I also recognized that this was part of life, the way some people assert their influence, the way family relationships evolve, and sometimes the way love is tested by circumstance. One afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen, quietly preparing tea as she moved about, organizing the shelves. She glanced at me once, her eyes sharp, and said softly, almost as if testing me, "Don't worry. You'll get used to it." I understood the meaning behind those words. They were not meant to comfort. They were meant to assert her control, to remind me that my presence here was conditional, not natural. And yet, I smiled faintly, choosing calm over confrontation, dignity over argument. As the days passed, I began to observe the ways the house itself seemed to shift. Rooms that once carried my laughter, my energy, my routines, now followed her rhythm. I noticed how my own belongings were subtly moved, how my favorite chair was relocated, how my small traditions like the placement of the tablecloth or the arrangement of flowers were replaced with her choices. It was a gentle, quiet erasure of the familiar, and yet I refused to let it break me. I also noticed the subtle changes in my son's behavior. He was no longer as eager to share his day with me. He seemed to walk on a line between loyalty to me and devotion to her, unsure of where to place his own words, his own love. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the hesitation in his voice, the small moments where he wanted to reach out but did not. And I realized that my pain was not just about her, it was also about him. About the distance that had grown quietly over time. About the way love and family bonds can be strained by circumstance. I found small ways to maintain my connection with the home, to assert my presence without confrontation. I continued my routines, preparing meals quietly, tending to small tasks that brought order to the house. I would sit by the window in the late afternoon, letting the sunlight fill me, letting the memories of laughter and love soothe the ache in my chest. I reminded myself that patience was a strength, that endurance had its own dignity, that the bonds of family could withstand trials if nurtured with quiet care. At night, I would sit alone, reflecting on the day. I thought about the balance between speaking up and remaining silent, between asserting myself and observing quietly. I thought about the many lessons life had taught me, that love is not always rewarded immediately, that patience can be a form of resistance, and that dignity is maintained through calmness, not argument. And though I felt the sting of exclusion, I also felt a quiet pride that I could endure without bitterness, that I could remain steadfast in my love. Even when it seemed unappreciated, I also took time to observe her, to understand her intentions and the way she influenced the household. I realized that while her actions caused pain, they were also part of her own insecurities, her own need to establish a place in a family that had long existed before she arrived. Understanding this did not erase the hurt, but it softened it. It allowed me to approach the situation with empathy, to see beyond my own suffering, and to consider the perspectives of those around me. Through it all, I held on to hope. Hope that my son would recognize the depth of my care, that he would remember the years spent nurturing him, and that he would one day see the importance of my place in his life. Hope that the home we built together could remain a place of warmth, even amidst the tension and conflict. Hope that love, patience, and quiet strength could endure where arguments and resentment might fail. And in that hope, I found a kind of peace. Not a loud or dramatic peace, but a quiet, enduring sense of resilience. I knew that life would continue, that challenges would pass, that relationships could be mended, and that love could survive even the harshest tests. And so I moved forward, day by day, quietly maintaining my presence, observing the changes, and holding on to the memories that could never be taken from me. The tension in the house began to grow slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It wasn't a sudden argument or a loud confrontation, it was the quiet accumulation of small actions, subtle gestures, and unspoken words that carried far more weight than I could have imagined. I noticed it in the way my son would pause before speaking to me, as if unsure of what was allowed. I noticed it in the way she would glance at me sharply before taking a step, adjusting a plate, or choosing where we would sit for dinner. These small signals built up like invisible walls, separating me from the family I had loved and nurtured for decades. One evening, as I prepared the dinner table, I noticed she had moved my favorite dishes to a different cupboard. I reached for a plate out of habit and found it gone, replaced by a set of fine china I barely recognized. She saw my confusion and smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I thought this would look nicer here," she said, her voice calm but firm. I nodded politely, saying nothing. Inside, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name: disappointment, hurt, perhaps even disbelief. The home I had created, the traditions I had upheld, were being subtly rewritten without my consent. And yet, no one seemed to notice, no one seemed to care. The next day, I tried to speak to my son about it. I chose my words carefully, hoping to find understanding. "Do you remember how we used to keep the table?" I asked gently. He looked at me, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. "Mom, it's different now. Things have changed," he said softly. His words, meant perhaps to be gentle, struck me with unexpected force. Things have changed. Yes, they had changed, but not in a way that felt right to me. I realized then that the home I thought I knew was no longer mine in the same way. Small incidents like these multiplied. I found that decisions about the house, about meals, about routines were being made without consulting me. I tried to adapt, to accept, to let go of the little things, but it was as if the very fabric of the household was being rewoven in a way that left me on the outside. Even the children, my grandchildren, seemed to be taking cues from her. They asked for things in a different tone, looked to her for guidance first, and sometimes forgot the lessons I had spent years teaching them. I felt a growing sense of isolation, not because I was unloved, but because my role had quietly shifted to the margins. One afternoon, I found myself in the living room, quietly reading a letter from a friend. I heard her footsteps approaching and glanced up. She paused by the doorway, watching me, and then said casually, "You know, you could do it differently. It might be easier if you tried." I didn't respond immediately. The words were polite, almost harmless, yet I felt a sharp undercurrent of judgment. It wasn't just that she wanted things her way, it was that she was challenging my very presence, implying that I was incapable of handling this household correctly. I felt the sting of injustice. But again, I chose silence, because I had learned long ago that calm endurance often speaks louder than words. The subtle conflicts continued in other ways. Meals were planned without asking me, family outings were scheduled without my input, and even small decisions about the home's decor seemed to exclude me entirely. I began to notice a pattern, an unspoken hierarchy forming within the family. My son, once the boy who would run to me for comfort and guidance, now seemed hesitant, almost fearful of speaking openly in my presence. I realized that the tension wasn't just between her and me, it was seeping into every relationship within the household. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I overheard a conversation that pierced me deeply. My daughter-in-law was speaking to a friend on the phone, mentioning how she was managing the household and keeping my son aligned. The words, casual and almost careless, made my chest tighten. Managing the household, aligning my son. The phrasing reduced years of love, care, and mutual respect into something transactional, something to be controlled. I felt a mix of sorrow and disbelief. This was the person who now shaped my son's world, who held sway over the life I had helped nurture. Even moments that once brought joy now carried tension. Family dinners, which used to be filled with laughter and conversation, became exercises in caution. I found myself choosing my words carefully, waiting for the right moment to speak, measuring the impact of even a smile. I realized that the home was no longer a place of unconditional love. It had become a place of negotiation, of unspoken rules, of invisible lines I dared not cross. Despite this, I found ways to maintain my dignity. I continued with my routines, quietly caring for the house, preparing meals with love, and offering support where it was needed. I watched my son, studied his hesitation, and found moments to connect with him in small, meaningful ways. A quiet compliment here, a gentle word there, these were my tools, my ways of asserting love without confrontation. I realized that patience and subtle persistence could hold more power than loud arguments or displays of anger. Yet, there were moments when the conflict became harder to bear. I remember a particular evening when she openly questioned one of my decisions about dinner, suggesting an alternative in a tone that left no room for discussion. My son, sitting beside her, nodded in agreement. The quiet weight of exclusion settled over me like a heavy blanket. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to reclaim my space, but the calm voice within urged restraint. I reminded myself that my strength was not in proving a point but in maintaining my composure, in demonstrating the enduring nature of love and patience. In those days, I spent more time reflecting than ever before. I thought about the years spent nurturing my family, the countless sacrifices I had made, and the love that had shaped every corner of this home. I realized that conflict, while painful, was part of life. That challenges were opportunities to demonstrate resilience, compassion, and quiet dignity. And though I felt the sting of exclusion deeply, I also recognized that this was a test not of my son, not of my daughter-in-law, but of myself. I began to observe small patterns in her behavior, to understand her motivations, to anticipate her actions. I noticed how she sought control in subtle ways, how she asserted dominance quietly, how she expected compliance. And in understanding her, I found the ability to navigate the tension with grace. I could not control her actions, nor could I dictate my son's responses, but I could control my own heart, my own words, my own presence. These realizations did not remove the pain, they only gave it structure, a way to endure it without losing myself. I reminded myself daily that my love for my family was not diminished by conflict, that my role as a mother, a grandmother, a caretaker, was defined not by approval but by consistency, by quiet strength, by patience that carried its own dignity. And so, I moved forward day by day, quietly observing, carefully choosing my words, maintaining routines and holding on to hope. Hope that the storm of tension would pass, that understanding might come, that my son would remember the foundation we had built together. And in that hope, I found a fragile but enduring sense of calm, a strength that would carry me into the deeper conflicts that lay ahead. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in our household became increasingly palpable. The subtle shifts that I had noticed earlier had grown more pronounced, yet the conflict remained quiet, almost invisible to anyone outside. It was in the tone of a comment, the timing of a glance, the way my son would hesitate before acknowledging me in front of her. I began to feel as if I were walking through a house that no longer fully belonged to me, as though my very presence had become an inconvenience. One afternoon, I decided to bake my son's favorite pie, hoping that the familiar scent and the warmth of the kitchen might create a small bridge between us. As I mixed the ingredients carefully, measuring each one just as I always had, I thought about the countless times he had helped me stir, laughed at my jokes, and asked endless questions about the flavors. The kitchen had once been our sanctuary, a place of laughter and learning. But now, when I placed the pie on the counter, she walked in, glanced at it, and said with a polite smile, "Oh, I already bought a dessert for tonight. You don't have to bother." Her words were casual, almost neutral in tone, but inside I felt the familiar sting of exclusion. My gesture, meant to nurture and bring warmth, was dismissed, erased by her assertion of control. My son looked at me then, his eyes flickering with unease, unsure whether to defend me or remain silent. He said nothing, and I smiled faintly, pretending not to feel the hurt. I knew in my heart that speaking up would only create tension, but the ache in my chest reminded me that this was only the beginning of a much deeper struggle. Over time, I began to notice other subtle ways in which my space and voice were being diminished. Conversations that once included me now bypassed me entirely. Decisions about household plans, family events, and even small daily routines were made without any consultation. I overheard her on the phone, explaining things to her friends as if the house belonged solely to her and my son, reducing years of my own care and effort to background noise. The realization that I was being edged out in this way was painful, yet I resolved to maintain my composure. One evening, as we sat in the living room, she suggested a rearrangement of the furniture. I had placed a comfortable armchair by the window where I liked to read, where the light fell just so on the pages of my books. She proposed moving it across the room, claiming it would look better for the space. My son, as always, nodded in agreement. I felt the weight of the shift, my familiar routines, my little comforts, my spaces of calm, being altered to fit her vision rather than ours. I said nothing, quietly letting her rearrange, but a small flame of frustration simmered within me. I reminded myself that endurance is not weakness, that patience is strength, and that love must survive even when unacknowledged. It was not only the home that reflected the tension but also the interactions at the dinner table. Conversations became carefully curated, words chosen with caution. I noticed the children, my grandchildren, subtly adjusting their behavior to match her expectations. They no longer called to me first, no longer included me naturally in their stories and jokes. Even my son, who once shared every thought, every triumph, every concern with me, now measured his words, choosing silence where openness had once flourished. I could see the subtle lines forming, delineating her family from mine, and it was a painful observation to endure. One particularly difficult day, I found myself in the study, sorting through old photographs. I had pulled out pictures of my son as a child, his small hands in mine, the laughter on his face, the joy of family holidays. She entered the room and glanced at the photos. "So many old memories," she said lightly, but her tone carried a subtle edge, a quiet assertion of her dominance. I looked up at her, trying to maintain calm, reminding myself that this was not a battle to be won with words or confrontation, but a struggle to remain present, dignified, and composed amidst the subtle exclusions. Even the smallest gestures became battlegrounds for influence. A comment about the way I folded the laundry, a suggestion on how the dishes should be arranged, or a remark about the decor of the living room, it all carried weight. I learned to listen closely, to understand the unspoken hierarchies forming, to anticipate moments that could cause conflict, and to navigate them with quiet patience. My presence, while diminishing in authority, remained steadfast in care and consistency. A silent testament to the love that had built this family, I found solace in observing moments of genuine connection, however rare. A smile from my son across the room, a fleeting acknowledgement of my efforts, or the quiet laughter of a grandchild when I shared a small story. All of these reminded me that my role, while challenged, was still meaningful. I held on to these moments, nurturing them as carefully as I would a fragile flower, knowing they carried the seeds of hope for reconciliation and understanding in the days to come. During these weeks, I also reflected deeply on my own emotions, recognizing that resentment would only erode my peace. I reminded myself that this was a test of endurance, a trial of patience, and an opportunity to demonstrate the power of quiet strength. I practiced empathy, imagining her life, her insecurities, her desire to establish herself in the family. Understanding her motivations did not lessen the hurt, but it softened it, allowing me to maintain dignity in the face of exclusion. The rising conflict was no longer simply about household routines or minor disagreements. It had become a test of emotional resilience. Every interaction required careful navigation, every word measured, every gesture considered. I felt the weight of unspoken rules, the invisible pressure to conform, the subtle assertion of authority that challenged my presence. And yet, I chose calm patience and quiet determination, knowing that the deeper bonds of family, nurtured through decades of love, could withstand these trials if approached with steadfastness and grace. By the end of these weeks, I realized that the rising conflict had fundamentally changed the dynamics of our household. The home I once knew had evolved into a space where power and influence were contested quietly, and where love required careful navigation. Yet, amidst the tension, I held on to hope that my son would remember the depth of our bond, that the children would recognize the continuity of care I had provided, and that one day, understanding and reconciliation would emerge from the shadows of conflict. And so, I prepared myself for what lay ahead, knowing that the true test of my patience, love, and quiet strength was still to come. The conflict had risen, but it had not yet reached its turning point. That moment, when the consequences of words and actions would be revealed, was approaching, and I had to be ready, steadfast and unwavering in the calm endurance that had carried me thus far. The turning point came quietly, almost without warning, yet the impact was profound. It was not a loud confrontation or a single dramatic event, it was a culmination of months of subtle exclusion, quiet judgments, and unspoken decisions. I had grown accustomed to the tension, learned to navigate it with patience, but that afternoon, the weight of everything finally pressed down with undeniable clarity. I had prepared my son's favorite meal, a dish he had loved since childhood. As I carried the plates to the dining table, I noticed her standing by the doorway, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me with a faint smile. "I thought I would handle dinner tonight," she said softly, as if this was merely a casual suggestion. But the underlying message was clear. My efforts were unnecessary, unwanted, and irrelevant. My son, seated at the table, did not lift a finger to intervene. He did not say a word. His silence felt heavier than any argument I could have spoken. I placed the plates down, forcing a smile, hiding the ache inside. Yet I could not shake the sting of the moment. All the years of care, the countless meals prepared, the quiet gestures of love suddenly felt diminished, almost invisible. I realized then that the house, the family, and even my own son's attentions were no longer mine to shape. It was a realization that cut deeper than any harsh word. A silent confirmation that my role had shifted from central to peripheral. Later that evening, I overheard a conversation that made my heart tighten. My son and daughter-in-law were speaking in the living room. I could not hear every word, but certain phrases reached me clearly. She spoke of rearranging everything and making decisions without interference, while he responded with hesitant agreement. The implication was clear. My presence, my opinions, and my guidance were no longer considered essential. I felt a quiet grief settle in me, a grief not for myself alone, but for the gradual erosion of bonds I had nurtured for decades. The first real confrontation came a few days later. I had tried to speak with my son about a minor household matter, something about the schedule of chores. I approached him gently, hoping to discuss it privately. "Can we talk for a moment?" I asked softly. His eyes flickered with discomfort. Before he could respond, she interjected. "I've already decided on this. Don't worry about it," she said, smiling faintly, her tone polite but firm. I realized then that this was no longer about small disagreements, it was about authority, control, and the subtle disempowerment of my presence. In that moment, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, sadness, disbelief, and a quiet sense of betrayal. My son, who I had raised with care and patience, did not speak up to defend me. The realization hit me hard. My role as the guiding force in the household was being undermined, and my son was allowing it to happen. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that anger would not serve me, that patience and quiet strength were my true allies. Yet, the pain of being dismissed in my own home was sharp and undeniable. The days that followed were even more challenging. She began to make decisions about family finances, social plans, and even celebrations without consulting me. Invitations were extended to friends and relatives with no mention of my input. Even my grandchildren began to mirror her approach, seeking her guidance first and bypassing me entirely. I watched silently, feeling a growing chasm between my son and me, a chasm that seemed to widen with each passing day. One evening, the situation reached its emotional apex. I had prepared a family gathering for a small holiday celebration, something I had always cherished. As I entered the living room carrying the last dish, I noticed that she had rearranged the entire setup. The table, the decorations, even the seating arrangement had been changed to reflect her preferences. My son did not stop her. He did not say a word. The room, which once echoed with laughter and warmth, now felt alien, cold, and controlled by forces that I could not influence. I felt a quiet tear roll down my cheek, not from anger, but from the recognition of what had truly changed. The home I had built with care, love, and patience was no longer the same. My son, my child, had allowed another to take the reins, to redefine the space we once shared. I realized then that this was not a fleeting moment of tension, it was a fundamental shift. A turning point that marked the beginning of profound change in our family dynamics. In the days that followed, the subtle confrontations continued, each one adding weight to the emotional burden. I learned to navigate them with quiet composure, speaking only when necessary, choosing my words carefully, and focusing on small gestures of love and care that could not be dismissed. Yet, the sense of exclusion, the quiet realization that my authority and presence had been diminished, lingered like a shadow over every interaction. Despite the growing tension, I found moments of reflection and hope. I reminded myself that love, patience, and dignity were stronger than conflict. That understanding, empathy, and silent endurance could withstand even the most painful shifts in family dynamics. And though the turning point had brought clarity, it also brought an opportunity to demonstrate resilience, to nurture bonds quietly, and to prepare for the moment when understanding and reconciliation might return. By the end of this period, I understood the truth. The household had changed irrevocably. The roles within it had shifted, and my son's allegiance had been subtly redirected. Yet, I also understood that my response, my patience, my quiet strength, my enduring love would define the outcome far more than the actions of others. And in that understanding, I found a small glimmer of hope, a quiet determination to remain steadfast, compassionate, and present. No matter how invisible my efforts seemed, the tension that had been simmering for months finally reached a point where it could no longer remain silent. The subtle exclusions, the quiet dismissals, and the small but consistent gestures of control culminated in a moment that would change everything. One evening, as I was placing the last touches on dinner, she walked in and said words that pierced me to my core. "This is not your home anymore." Her voice was calm, almost casual, yet the meaning was unmistakable. I froze for a moment, holding the serving platter in my hands. The room seemed to shrink around me, and my heart thudded painfully. I had known, deep down, that the growing distance between my son and me, and her influence, had been shifting the dynamics of our home. But hearing it spoken aloud made the reality undeniable. I placed the platter down quietly, forcing a calm smile onto my face. "I see," I whispered softly, keeping my tone gentle. I wanted to respond with anger, to demand respect for years of devotion and care, yet I recognized that confrontation would only create deeper rifts. Instead, I chose silence, allowing her words to linger while maintaining the dignity I had cultivated throughout this journey. My son, seated at the table, looked at me with a conflicted expression. There was guilt, yes, but also hesitation, a reluctance to challenge her or acknowledge my pain. I could see the inner struggle in his eyes, the tension between loyalty to his wife and the unspoken bond we shared as mother and son. He said nothing. His silence, though painful, spoke volumes about the depth of the rift that had grown in our family. That night, I retreated to the quiet of my room. I sat by the window, watching the fading sunlight, reflecting on how life had shifted so dramatically. The home I had known, filled with warmth, laughter, and the love of generations, now felt like a space where my voice and presence were no longer welcome. The betrayal was not loud or violent, it was quiet, insidious, and deeply personal. In the following days, I noticed even more subtle changes. She began to reorganize the house to suit her vision, moving furniture, changing decor, and even redirecting attention during family gatherings. My son followed her lead, often without realizing the impact of his actions on me. Conversations that once included me now excluded me entirely. Even the children began to adapt, following her cues and mirroring her influence. Each interaction reminded me that the turning point had arrived, the moment when our family dynamics were irrevocably altered. I began to understand that this was not merely a conflict about space or control. It was a test of patience, resilience, and emotional endurance. I could no longer rely on the past, on the history of care and shared memories, to preserve my place in the household. Instead, I had to navigate the present, responding with quiet dignity, compassion, and unwavering love. My voice had to remain measured, My gestures gentle, my presence steadfast. One afternoon, I tried to speak with my son privately, hoping to express my feelings without creating confrontation. I feel like I'm losing my place in this home, I said softly, my eyes meeting his. I want us to remain connected, to feel like a family. He looked down, his hands twisting nervously. Mom, I don't know what to say, he murmured, his voice tinged with guilt. His hesitation revealed the struggle within him, loyalty to his wife, fear of conflict, and a fading awareness of the bond we had shared that evening. I realized that the turning point was more than a moment, it was a series of decisions, small and large, that had collectively redefined the household. My son's silence, her insistence, the subtle shifts in behavior together, they marked a point of no return, where the family dynamic was being reshaped around her influence. I felt a pang of sorrow, but I also understood that I had to remain strong, patient, and resolute. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting deeply on the meaning of love, family, and resilience. I thought about the countless sacrifices I had made, the guidance I had offered, and the love I had poured into this home. I realized that none of these efforts could be measured by acknowledgement alone. My care, my presence, and my integrity mattered not because they were recognized, but because they reflected who I was and the values I held dear. Even in the midst of exclusion, I chose moments of quiet connection. A gentle smile to my grandchildren, a thoughtful gesture for my son, a small act of care for the household, all became ways to assert my presence without confrontation. I learned that resilience does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, persists quietly, and endures against the odds. The days blurred into weeks, and the pain of being pushed aside remained, yet I found strength in reflection, faith, and hope. I reminded myself that relationships can weather storms, that love can endure absence and silence, and that patience is often the most powerful form of resistance. The turning point had arrived, but it had also offered clarity, a clear understanding of the family dynamics, the challenges ahead, and the path I would take with grace, dignity, and quiet courage. And in the silence of my room, watching the evening sky, I resolved that no matter how deep the distance, no matter how subtle the betrayals, my love would remain unwavering, and my patience steadfast. The turning point had come, but it would not define me. It would only reveal the strength of my spirit, the depth of my heart, and the enduring power of quiet resilience. The days after the turning point felt heavy, but they also marked the beginning of a subtle shift. I began to understand that resolution would not arrive in a single conversation or a dramatic gesture. Instead, it would come slowly, quietly, through patience, empathy, and small moments of understanding. I reminded myself that relationships, especially within families, are rarely linear. Healing takes time, and sometimes it requires enduring discomfort while maintaining integrity. I started focusing on the little ways I could connect with my son and grandchildren. I found that even small gestures, a cup of tea prepared just the way he liked it, a quiet smile exchanged over breakfast, or a handwritten note left on the kitchen table could reach him more than words ever could. In the beginning, my efforts went unnoticed. He was distracted, caught in the whirlwind of his new life, and often aligned with her decisions without considering my feelings. Yet, I persevered, understanding that love is often silent, persistent, and unassuming. One afternoon, I found myself alone with my son while the children were at school. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock filling the room. I decided to speak from the heart, keeping my voice gentle and steady. I know things have changed, I began. I know your life is full, and you have responsibilities I can't always understand. But I hope you remember the bond we share, the years we've spent together, and the love that remains constant. He looked at me, his eyes heavy with unspoken feelings. For the first time in months, he didn't look away or hesitate. He listened. I continued, speaking slowly, choosing my words carefully. I don't want arguments or control. I only want to remain a part of your life, and for you to know that my love has never wavered. I want us to continue to share this family, despite the changes. He nodded slowly, a mix of guilt, reflection, and understanding flickering across his face. "Mom, I've been so caught up. I didn't realize. I'm sorry," he said quietly. His voice was hesitant but sincere. That moment was a fragile opening, a doorway through which reconciliation could begin. I held back tears, keeping my composure, and offered only a gentle smile. Over the following weeks, I noticed small changes. He began to seek my advice again, not always deferring to her, but considering my perspective alongside hers. The children began to include me in conversations and games, sometimes pausing in their activities to ask for my thoughts. I realized that my patience, quiet presence, and unwavering love had begun to make an impact. It was not instant, and it was not always acknowledged, but it was real. One evening, I received a small gesture that touched me deeply. My son placed a cup of tea on the table in front of me and said softly, "I made this for you, Mom, just how you like it." It was a simple act, almost ordinary, but it carried a profound message: recognition, care, and a step toward reconciliation. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a reminder that even small gestures can signify healing. I also found that forgiveness was as much for myself as it was for others. Holding on to hurt and resentment only deepened the emotional burden. By choosing compassion, I discovered a sense of peace that allowed me to navigate interactions with calmness and clarity. Even when disagreements arose, I approached them with understanding, seeking to communicate rather than to win. During this period, I reflected deeply on the nature of family and relationships. I realized that roles change, influence shifts, and dynamics evolve. Yet, the core of family love, shared history, and connection can endure, even when it seems fragile. It is sustained not by control or authority, but by patience, presence, and the quiet commitment to care. By the end of this part, I could see subtle but meaningful reconciliation beginning to take shape. My son was more attentive. My daughter-in-law, though still assertive, began to recognize my presence in the household, and the children were inclusive once more. The resolution was not complete, but the cracks in the walls of distance were beginning to close. The turning point had set the stage for understanding, and now the process of healing had quietly begun. I reminded myself daily that love, patience, and resilience are more powerful than any argument or conflict. Though hurt had been felt, it did not define the future. By holding steadfast, continuing to act with kindness and understanding, and embracing the slow rhythm of reconciliation, I had begun to rebuild the bonds that had been stretched to their limits, and in these quiet moments, I found a sense of calm strength. The home was no longer exactly as it had once been, but it was evolving into a space where love and connection could still flourish. I learned that resolution is not an event, it is a journey, and every small step toward understanding, every moment of gentle care, brings us closer to the healing we seek. As the days turned into weeks, the house slowly began to feel like a home again, though it had changed. The quiet tension that once hung in the air started to lift, replaced by small but significant gestures of reconciliation. My son would occasionally pause his conversations with her to ask for my opinion. He would include me in decisions, sometimes hesitating, sometimes unsure, but making the effort. And though she still maintained her strong presence, there were moments when she acknowledged my place without words, a glance, a nod, or leaving me space at the table. I realized that forgiveness and resolution are often not loud or dramatic. They are subtle, quiet, and cumulative. One evening, as I watched my grandchildren play in the living room, I felt a warmth that had been missing for months. They laughed and included me in their game, occasionally tugging at my hands or looking for my reaction. Their joy reminded me that despite the hardships, love had a way of returning, of bridging the distance that had grown between us. I also began to reflect on my own emotions. I recognized that lingering resentment or bitterness would only create more barriers. Each day, I made a conscious choice to approach interactions with patience and understanding, to prioritize connection over confrontation. I found that by releasing my expectations and simply being present, I was creating opportunities for healing that words alone could not achieve. One afternoon, my son approached me privately. "Mom," he said softly, "I realize I haven't been there for you the way I should have. I've been distracted, but I want to make things right." His voice trembled slightly, and I could see genuine remorse in his eyes. I smiled gently, feeling the weight of months of worry and sadness begin to ease. "Thank you," I replied. "All I want is for us to stay connected. That is enough." Over time, the atmosphere in our home began to shift. Conversations became more inclusive, laughter returned to the dinner table, and small acts of care became commonplace again. I found that the turning point, painful as it was, had created the space necessary for understanding and reconciliation to grow. I also noticed that my own heart was lighter. By choosing empathy over anger, by remaining patient despite exclusion, and by silently demonstrating my love, I had regained a sense of peace. I realized that resolution is not only about changing others, it is about cultivating resilience and compassion within ourselves. In these moments of quiet healing, I observed subtle changes in her behavior as well. While she remained assertive, there were times when she sought my input, asked my advice, or simply allowed my presence to coexist with hers without conflict. I recognized that even small acknowledgments like these were steps toward a restored family balance. Through this process, I learned that family dynamics are rarely static. They shift with time, influence, and circumstance. Yet, when approached with patience, understanding, and love, even the most strained relationships can find moments of reconciliation. I had experienced exclusion, hurt, and betrayal, but I had also witnessed the power of quiet persistence, empathy, and forgiveness. I also noticed a subtle shift in her, the daughter-in-law who had once seemed determined to exclude me. She began to allow my presence in small ways, sharing brief conversations or asking for my input on household matters. It was not always smooth, and at times, old tensions surfaced, but the foundation for mutual respect was being laid. I realized that reconciliation often requires time, and that even small gestures of acknowledgement are steps toward healing. Through it all, I learned to hold my own heart with care. I discovered that patience is not passive, it is active, conscious, and sometimes requires courage. To forgive, to remain present, and to continue showing love in the face of neglect is a form of quiet strength that carries its own rewards. The home began to feel alive again. Laughter returned in small doses. Shared meals became moments of genuine connection, and the children began to include me once more in games, stories, and shared secrets. I realized that the pain I had endured had not been in vain. It had taught me resilience, empathy, and the enduring nature of love. One rainy afternoon, my son brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me. "I hope you know, Mom," he said, "that we are grateful for you." "I am grateful for you." I felt tears prick my eyes, but I held them back, smiling quietly. Words cannot always capture the depth of emotion, but the simplicity of that acknowledgement spoke volumes. I also reflected on my own journey within God's plan. I understood that patience, humility, and silent perseverance are often tested in family relationships. The challenges I faced had not been a punishment but a lesson, a reminder that God watches, that He understands struggles unseen by others, and that our steadfast love and patience carry divine significance. Through these reflections, I felt a sense of closure settling over my heart. Not closure in the sense of perfection or flawless harmony, but in the sense of understanding, acceptance, and hope. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but I had cultivated the inner strength to meet them with calmness and compassion. As the sun set one evening, casting a golden glow across the living room, I realized that love, patience, and forgiveness had quietly transformed our family. The walls that once echoed with silence and tension now carried warmth, understanding, and moments of joy. Though the journey had been long and difficult, the destination, a home of quiet resilience and enduring connection, was within reach, and in that reflection, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, for the relationships restored, and for the quiet, persistent strength that had guided me through the hardest chapters of my life. I understood now that true love does not demand recognition, it continues to shine. Quietly, steadfastly, and unwaveringly. Regardless of the obstacles it encounters, the days that followed brought a sense of quiet harmony to our home. There were still small misunderstandings, moments when old habits crept in, and fleeting tensions that reminded me of how fragile reconciliation can be. But the overall feeling had shifted from distance to connection, from silence to subtle conversations, from exclusion to inclusion. I could finally sense the home breathing again, alive with the presence of love, care, and understanding. One morning, my son approached me with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, I want you to know," he said softly, "that I see you now not just as my mother, but as the foundation of our family. I've been blind to it for too long." My heart swelled, not with pride, but with relief, understanding, and gratitude. It was moments like these that made the months of patience, quiet endurance, and silent love worthwhile. I realized that the real lesson of this journey was not only about family but also about myself. It taught me that strength is often quiet, that love persists even when unrecognized, and that patience can be more powerful than confrontation. By remaining steadfast in my care, my presence, and my humility, I had nurtured healing, and slowly, the family had begun to respond. The children continued to include me in small ways, asking for advice, sharing their thoughts, or simply sitting close while we watched a movie together. Each small interaction reminded me that connection is built gradually, like threads woven patiently into a tapestry. The simple joys of shared laughter, quiet conversations, and gentle gestures were the true markers of restored relationships. Even my daughter-in-law, who had once seemed determined to exclude me, began to show subtle signs of respect and acknowledgement. She occasionally asked my opinion, gave me space at family events, and allowed the children to maintain their bond with me freely. It was not perfect, and it was not always comfortable, but it was progress, and that was meaningful enough. I also found deep comfort in reflection and faith. I understood that sometimes God asks us to endure, to remain patient, and to love without expectation. The struggles I faced were not in vain. They were shaping me, strengthening me, and teaching me the value of forgiveness, resilience, and silent perseverance. I realize that when we act with compassion and understanding, even in the face of exclusion or hurt, we honor both ourselves and those around us. One evening, as I looked around the quiet house, I reflected on the journey we had all taken, the pain, the misunderstandings, the distance, and now, the slow return of connection. I felt a sense of calm and gratitude. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, but I also knew that we had laid a foundation for love, respect, and understanding that could endure. And this is where my story ends tonight. Life doesn't always give us answers right away. Sometimes, God asks us to stay patient, stay kind, and stay silent, not because we are weak, but because He sees what others do not. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect. Maybe someone needed this reminder today. Thank you for listening with an open heart. May God see every silent struggle and replace pain with peace. Until next time, this was Voice of Auntie Universe.